Good evening, and thank you for attending this evening. My name is Bob Paul. I'm the mayor of Huntington Woods, and we'd like to welcome you to the Detroit Zoo and Huntington Woods for our Save My City presentation put on by the Michigan Municipal League. We have Tony Minguini here with us tonight to lead us through a short presentation and then take some question and answers afterwards. We felt that it was important to inform residents how the current state funding model no longer works, and we need to urge our legislators to look at alternative funding strategies. So here is Tony to lead us.
I'm hiding behind you. Is this working? Okay, great. Appreciate everybody coming. Hopefully we'll try to make a very dry topic, not quite so dry, but let's blow through this real quick. Old picture of myself, always nice. So, you know, when you think of great places and you think of places that matter and places that resonate, everyone has a vision. Everyone knows when they see it. Some examples scrolling behind me here. It's places you want to be a part of, places maybe you want to live or you're going to go visit. And those are all the types of places that our communities are trying to create. But unfortunately, in Michigan right now, we're seeing far too much of this. We have places that don't work. And these places are a symptom of a bigger problem. We have a broken municipal finance model here in Michigan. And it's really affecting our community's ability to provide those services that residents and businesses all want to rely on. So what's happening and why should you care? Because our model is so broken, it really affects our ability to attract and retain people in this state. And we're seeing it when you look across the country. We're seeing the fact that in our population we're not keeping pace and other things. So we've got to start thinking differently about this if we want to be successful. So we're going to talk about some of that tonight and hopefully have you leave here today with a little bit different perspective and a little bit better understanding about what's going on and why it matters. So what are some of the issues? First and foremost, if I had to say one thing about our system and sit down, which I would never do, by the way, but if I had to, I would say this: our system just simply doesn't track with the economy. So right now, most folks, I think, would, if you ask them, they say the economy's doing better, my 401's doing better, everything's generally ticking up, interest rates are good, and you probably think that translates to your local government, and it does not, because our system is broken. So we got to start thinking differently about that. What can we do to make sure that we have that? Because without that, we're going to always have a problem. Michigan's budget priorities have disinvested in local government. We have had a systematic removal of revenue from local government at the state level. And we're going to talk about why that is and how dramatic that is and the impact that that's having. A lot of the problems can't be fixed locally. You'll hear folks all the time say, you got to make some tough decisions, city. You're not making those tough choices. It's not true. We have a tremendous amount of legal restrictions that impact us and prevent us from making a lot of those changes. So we've got to start thinking differently. If we're going to be successful in making change, state's got to be a partner in this. We don't have enough tools in our toolbox. I get to go all over the country on behalf of the residents of the city as part of the league, and there's leagues in every country, or in every state, excuse me. So we get a feel for what goes on around the country. And most places have significantly more tools at their disposal to either self-determination or funding or a lot of different things that we don't have in Michigan. We've got to empower our local governments, get that government closest to the people, more tools to provide the services their residents and their business wants. And we need a three-tiered approach. So we've been talking about this for about a year and a half now. And what we keep advocating for is revenues absolutely are part of this equation. There's no doubt that there's not enough money in the municipal system, but we do have to take a look at costs. We have some real cost issues. We got to be smarter about the structure, how we deliver services. So we're advocating change around all three of those areas. So to get into this, though, you got to start have an understanding of some of the facts that surround some of this stuff, give you the order of magnitude of what we're talking about. So this is kind of the graph that launched 1,000 ships. This is the total revenues that have flowed from all sources to local government from 2002 to 2012. It's that data set because it's census data and they update it. So we didn't create these numbers, we didn't extrapolate these numbers in any way. This is right out of the census. And Michigan is not only dead last in the country, but Michigan is the only state in the entire nation providing less resources to local government in 2012 than they were in 2002. Now think about that. On a competitive basis, just like businesses are competing for customers, our communities are competing for residents. They're competing to attract those businesses. This is their economic reality. Pretty much 50% is kind of the standard. How could we possibly expect them to compete if that's the fiscal reality that they face? And the answer is they can't. And our inability to get folks coming back to Michigan is evidence that they can't. We've got to start thinking differently. We must invest in the valuable assets that local governments are. They are the underpinnings of our economy, and we are disinvesting at them. And that's going to be our undoing. If you look at dollars that flow from the state, so we talk about revenue sharing. This is what we're talking about. Again, 50th in the nation. We had a little bit of company on the wrong side of the line, but we are lower than all of them put together. We've lost almost 56%. 56% over that 10-year period. And it's having a dramatic impact. We'll talk about that in a minute. This graph illustrates the challenges around our property tax system. So in Michigan, we have a couple constitutional amendments that both have an impact. You have the Headley Amendment, which limits the community as a whole, and then you have Proposal A, which limits parcel by parcel. I'm going to talk more about this later, but the combined effect of those means when property values drop, no matter how far they drop, they're essentially frozen at that level. And then they can only grow at inflation. So in aggregate, across the state, even accounting for those places that maybe did pretty well during the recession, we're at about 2005 levels. Again, think about that from a competitive standpoint. Cities' cost demands didn't change. Their biggest single revenue source is property taxes. We're at 2005 levels. We were just showing you some preliminary data about some of the revenue sharing stuff. That's down 56%. How do they compete? How do they provide those critical services that we all want, we all demand, we all expect? And the answer is they can't. We've got to start thinking differently about this stuff. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this revenue sharing impacts, we talked for years about the total amount of revenue sharing that was lost. And we talked about $4 billion, then $5 billion, then $6 billion, and $7 billion. Well, now we're at $8 billion. And nobody cared. So we started talking about this, about what does this mean to certain communities. We actually crunched that data a little bit, and we started putting some estimates together about what was lost by the various communities. The communities sponsoring this are up there. Oak Park's lost almost $19 million. I'm guessing $19 million would have a meaningful impact in Oak Park. Ferndale, $12 million. These are real cuts. These are real changes in how the city anticipated being able to provide for the long-term benefit of their residents. These dollars were provided for in statute. Some people say, well, how did you figure that out? How do you know what you're supposed to get? That's in the statute. It's very clear in the statute. What's not clear in the statute is the requirement of the legislature to appropriate the money. And so they've been diverting those dollars away from local service provision, and they've been funding the state bureaucracy, funding the balance sheet of the state. We're not getting more service at the state either. We're making a lot of balance sheets investments. And it's all at the expense of local government. We've got to start thinking differently about how we're going to fund local government and how we're going to affect change in the state. So one of the things the state likes to tell you was, hey, things were tough. Everybody's got to do their fair share around here. You guys complain all the time. It's not right. Well, during that same period of time, state's revenues were up 29%. In case you forgot, and I haven't, we were down 56%. That's not shared sacrifice. We did more than our fair share. More than our fair share. We would have happily accepted a 29% change if that's what the standard was for the different programs. But they make no mistake about this. Just like your city decides where they're going to spend the dollars that go into that budget, so too does the state. That's a budget priority decision. They said they matter more than you. Don't forget that. Here's just some of the areas that saw some increases in funding. You know, one of the ones I like to point out is the state police. Noble cause, they do great work. Cities use them. We have cut more officers at the local level across the state than exist in the state police department. That should give you some idea how bad this is. Fire cuts were just as deep. And even further, which no one really talks about, are those, you know, quote unquote non-essential services like recreation and roads and all the other things that we talk about all the time. But these so-called non-essential services are really the fabric of your community. And so I always take umbrage to the idea that they're not essential. We've disinvested in all those things so that the state bureaucracy can thrive. Nobody moves to Michigan. They move to one of your communities. They come here and they look for a home in your community. They look at the schools in your community. Businesses locate in your community. No one shows up at the border and says, I'm here. Put me where you want. They go to a place. And they go to that place because something about it speaks to them. And it's a combination of a lot of factors, all of which require us to fund local government appropriately. We've got to start thinking differently about how we do this. Change in total employment. Again, 50th in the nation. Go team. This is significant because think about it. Local government is the quintessential service organization. We don't make anything. All we do is people provide services to the folks in their community. So when you see a reduction in employees of over 20%, rest assured you're getting less services. We got to start thinking differently about that. When you think about what we are paying at the local level, and some folks might look at this and go, well, that's all right, we're paying less, that's okay. Yeah. If our only goal is to be the cheapest and not the best, then that's okay. But I want you to think about this. Just like any business wants to attract and retain good people, so too does local government. And trust me, you want good, competent people running your government. It's one of the most complicated jobs there is. Multiple business lines, incredibly diverse things that they have to be involved with, public pressure. If they have a bad day, it's on the front page. You need good people in those roles. Well, what we're doing here, what this does, is we used to be a state that attracted people here. People moved from other states to come here because Michigan was a great place to live and we wanted to attract good professionals. And now we are becoming an exporter. And what you're seeing is the folks that are more seasoned, they're going to play the string out. They're not probably going to go anywhere, most likely. What we don't have is a good, strong crop of the folks to fill in behind them. And if we don't figure this out soon, you're going to see a crisis in local government because we're not going to have those top professionals to run these places like we have today. Don't underestimate the exposure that that's creating for us. We look at total payroll. So again, think back to that graph. States saw 29% increases, and they raised their payroll by 24% during that same period of time. When you look at all local payrolls, so cities, villages, townships, and counties, we're down just under 15%. And if you just look at your cities and villages, we're down almost a third. We are doing way more than our fair share. Way more. And it's at the local level. When you think about the services you rely on every day, and the services that probably matter most to you, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's the services that are coming from your local government. And that's where we're disinvesting. It doesn't make sense. So when you think about, what do other people think about this? I'm going to stand up here and tell you I got it all figured out. And I do, by the way. But Close Up is a survey that's done by the University of Michigan. And they survey local officials. And so they get the mood of what they think's going on. And they asked a few questions around this topic in their last survey. And 64% of local government officials say, you know what? Yeah, the system is broken. We've got to do something different. This just doesn't work for us. 82% think that the state should deal with unfunded mandates. So for those of you that don't work in local government, an unfunded mandate is something that got created essentially when Headley passed. Because when Mr. Headley was crafting that amendment, he absolutely wanted to limit the growth in tax revenues. But he recognized that that created an exposure for cities. So he said, you know what, I'm going to put a protection in there. And if the state ever asks a city to do something post-Headley that they weren't doing before, the state's got to pay for that. And they call that an unfunded mandate. So here we sit 40 years later. And for those of you keeping score at home, the state has funded exactly none of those, ever. We've essentially been violating the Constitution. That's a huge deal. It's pushed tremendous burden down to the local level. 76% would support Headley reform. That does not mean repeal, by the way. Headley reform speaks to the fact that we now know, having lived with Headley and Prop A for a number of years, the way those two things interact doesn't work and goes beyond the intent of either one of those. Both of those amendments had the intention of limiting growth to inflation. The combination of the two creates less than inflationary growth for local communities. That's an easy fix, though. That can be fixed legislatively. I'll talk about that in a little more detail. And 66% say, you know what, we need more local revenue options. This is back to that idea of tools in the toolbox. Okay, you see something, you can figure out a solution, and if you have the ability to do some things locally, as a general rule, over 80% of local ballot initiatives typically pass. Because people understand it, they can point at it, and they know the benefit they're going to get from that. We need some of those options here at the local level. But what about the public? What does the public think? So during the last presidential cycle, we participated in an EPIC MRA poll and just asked a few questions around some of these issues. So just a few of the high points here. But 48%, so just about half, says, you know what, I do think local government is underfunded. They're recognizing some of the things and some of the challenges that we're seeing here. 52% would support higher taxes, not to get better services, not to get more services, just to preserve the services that they have. They don't want to lose anymore. They recognize the value and the importance of local services to their community, to their property values, to the businesses in their community. And they're willing to pay for that. 65% disapprove of the state's diversion of revenue sharing. Another way to think about that, if they had a choice where to send their dollar, they want to give it to local government rather than send it to Lansing. Again, they know where those services are coming from that matter most to them. And this gets back to this idea of tracking with the economy, okay? About half the people say, you know what, I would sort of expect in a strong economy I'd pay a little more in taxes, but our system doesn't allow that. There's never a catch-up in local government the way our system is built. We have unrestricted downward mobility and incredibly restricted upward mobility. We have the second most restrictive property tax system in the entire country, according to Michigan State. So what do we do? What do we do? There's a lot of different ideas that we could pursue. But again, in general, we're talking about this under three sort of buckets, as we've called them. We absolutely need to have more revenue to the system. No question about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We also have to deal with costs. There are certain cost drivers that are crippling us right now, and we've got to take a hard look at those. And then we got to think differently about the structure, about how we deliver services. We have a model that's been in place for many years, and we think there's some opportunities to do some stuff. So just to give you a few ideas, we need to fix our property tax system. We will not survive another recession if we don't fix this. We learned in the last recession, we saw something really for the first time in my career, where we saw significant declines in property values. Property taxes are the single biggest revenue source for local government. When those are allowed to drop without limit, and then once they reach that bottom point, can only grow at inflation or 5%, it's unsustainable. We have some communities that have lost upwards of 50% of their taxable value, and now they're stuck there. And the question I get a lot sometimes, well, when do they get back? How long till they're back to where they were? The answer is never. Because that cost line keeps trucking along up here. So that catch-up never happens. But we can fix that. So when Prop A passed, it did a couple things, right? Prop A is the one that said we're going to protect the individual property owner. We're not going to allow their taxable, that's when the whole idea of taxable value got created, and we're not going to allow those values to grow faster than inflation. But when they sell it, when someone sells their home or a business changes hands, those values will pop up. You may have heard that phrase before. It'll pop up, and that's when the city will get the benefit of those, not just the city, but all the taxing entities will get the benefit of those revenues. The problem is, when they crafted the legislation to do that, they did an overreach. And so what they said is, you know what we should do? We'll take those popped up values and we'll use that to calculate what happens under Headley, which has the effect of completely negating that pop-up growth. And it actually results in less than inflationary growth. That is not the intention of the Headley Amendment. That is not the intention of Prop A. But both of those things were done by legislation, and we can fix that. The other thing that they did when Prop A happened, Headley was actually crafted really well. Independent, it worked really well. So if you had greater than inflationary growth, your millage rate goes down. And if you have less than inflationary growth, your millage rate goes up. It had upward and downward mobility. It tracked with the economy. Mr. Headley understood that tracking with the economy is a fundamental need of any revenue system, and he built it that way. When they did Prop A, they took away the ability to roll back up. So imagine a community where you had a lot of growth, so millage rates rolled down. Then they have steep declines. The millage rate's still stuck where it was. And now the property values are below where they ever were. The two things in tandem are devastating. They can both be fixed legislatively. And here's the other thing that people need to realize. It would change no one's taxes today. Wouldn't generate $1 today. But what it does do is it creates recessionary protections going forward, and it provides that ability to track with the economy. That's an important reform that I hope we can get some serious traction on in Lansing. On the cost side, we've got to take a look at a lot of things, but one of them, we think the biggest one, is our OPEB obligations. OPEB is a fancy way of saying retiree health care. We have an $11 billion unfunded OPEB problem in the state of Michigan. And we've got to start thinking differently about how we provide that benefit. In no way are we suggesting we should take away all those benefits from all the folks that are retired and folks that are expecting to retire. But we have to be smarter about it. We've seen what happens when you don't address it. The cuts they made during the bankruptcy in Detroit were devastating to those folks. They went from having a good health plan to getting like $100 a month or something crazy like that. If we are smart and we make common sense reforms to this, we can provide good health care to folks, and we can do it at a much lower cost. We have 2017 health care right now being provided in some cases with plan designs that were done in the 1980s, 1990s. Now, nobody wants 1990 health care, but if you want 2017 health care, stands to reason, maybe we should have 2017 plan designs. We should look for ways to make these costs more affordable. And that will do two things. One, it will make the long-term viability of those benefits greater. Second, it will free up money to provide services at the local level. Because when I talk about it being an unfunded obligation, that means that the dollars that we're using to pay for that are directly being taken away from services that you would like to get today. So smart, common sense reform in this area would have a tremendous positive impact for the entire state. We also have to start thinking differently. And again, think about this kind of as a business, right? We need to have an investment strategy. Right now, the only way to balance a budget at the local level is to cut. We have no revenue generation tools. Property taxes, biggest source of revenue, 2 constitutional amendments, can't do anything. States cut revenue sharing, over $8 billion, can't do anything there. That's usually about 75% of a local budget. Layer on top of that, pretty much everything else is covered by a court decision called Bolt, which essentially means we have no ability to raise revenue at the local level. Now, if you think about the fact that that means the only thing I can do is cut, when you start making cuts to your budget, at first, they might be unnoticed. They might not be significant. At the point that those cuts become real and tangible, and people notice them, it diminishes the value of your community. When it diminishes the value of your community, now the cuts have the exact opposite impact you would hope they would have. They are actually lowering the value of your community, going to make you generate even less revenue. It's a death spiral and you can't break out of it. No business would survive doing that. A business would invest in their revenue generating capacity. They would say, what can we do to enhance revenues? How can we make us more profitable so that we can be more effective? We don't think that way. Imagine if I walked into a business on a Friday, I say, here, you guys are in trouble. I'm here to fix it. I'll make it all better. Oh, no, you're never going to do it, man. It's terrible here. Everything's out of balance. No, I'm good. You guys go home. You come in Monday. It'll be all fixed. And they roll in Monday, and I throw them the keys. And they say, where are you going? I'm like, it's all fixed. I told you I'd take care of it. You balanced our budget in one weekend? Absolutely. How'd you do it? I got to know. I closed all your factories. Well, that's how I make my money. Not my problem. Your budget's balanced. It's exactly what we do in local government. And the state will give you a gold star. Because if your budget's balanced, then you're a good manager. You're a good local government. We got to stop racing to the bottom. Our goal should not be to be the cheapest. Our goal should be to be the best. We've got to start thinking differently and investing in the incredible asset that our local governments are in driving a strong economy. Over 85% of the GDP comes out of our developed areas of the state. And that's where we're disinvesting. It doesn't make any sense. It's illogical. We should be investing in those places. We've got to start thinking differently. Where do we get the most bang for the buck? We have limited resources. So how do we maximize those? Where do we get the most bang for the buck? We've got to start thinking differently. Building and abandoning infrastructure, another hallmark of Michigan. We have doubled the built infrastructure in the state in the last 20 years or so. Doubled it. And we've added no people. No business would do that. Again, if I was in business and I had a plant operating at 50% capacity and my partner walked in and says, great news, I just landed a big contract. It's going to take us to 100% capacity, man. Finally, we're going to maximize the effectiveness of this plant. And I said, that's crazy. I'm going to go over to that vacant lot across that line over there. We'll build a new factory. Madness, right? But that's what we do in local government. We'll have a community with excess sewer capacity on this side of the line, and the state will give them a grant to build a new one on that side of the line. How's that a win? It's a waste of state resources, doesn't allow us to maximize our efficiencies. We got to start thinking differently about that. Why wouldn't we maximize those infrastructure investments? That's what happened to Flint, by the way. If you really want to understand what happened to Flint, that's what happened to Flint. They built infrastructure for 200,000 people. And then they had under 100,000 people trying to maintain it. You don't got to be a numbers person to figure that out. That don't work. That math problem just doesn't work. But that's what we do because we actually incent that in Michigan. We encourage you to go build something new, and we will give you more money because you built something new. If it's a business, we might even give you a tax break to build that something new. And we walk away from this stuff. And that's also a symptom of the OPEB problem. Because when I step across that line into my new town, I look back at that one and go, man, you guys are not very smart. You got all these costs. How come you're not funding your stuff? They walked out on the check. You went to the bathroom, you came back, you're the only one left, and everybody else been drinking all night. Now you got to figure out how to pay it. That's what's happening here. That's how we've built our system. We've got to start thinking differently about this stuff and how we're going to do this. Because the only thing that's going to sustain this state is true growth. True growth is not announcing that Foxconn or anybody else is coming here to build a plant. We say, yeah, we got more jobs. We need more people. We need more people. If we would have just kept pace since 1980, instead of 10 million people, anybody know how many people live in Michigan? If you're here last night, you can't play along. 14 million people. 14 million people. How different is our economy with 14 million people? How different are our roads, our schools? My golf game would be a lot better because I wouldn't be standing here. I'd be out working on it. 14 million people. We've got to do the things that get the people coming back to Michigan. So you think about what we have here in Michigan. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? Right? So we've made tremendous changes to our business taxes. We have an incredibly favorable tax environment. Not getting the people back. Great universities. Nope, not working. Natural resources, second to none. Not working. Most of the fresh water, not working. What's the one thing that the places that are winning are doing that we're not doing? And the answer is they're investing in their communities. I've told this story at least 100 times at this point. I have a lot of families moved to Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, in the last decade or so. Now, by rights, Phoenix should be a gas station stop on the way to California. It's in the middle of the desert. From April till October, it's too hot to go outside. They have no water. Their schools aren't as good. We beat them on every count except one. They're investing in their communities. Every time I go visit my family, there's something else new that I get to point and go, wow, that's amazing. Can't believe you guys are doing that. That's fantastic. And if you want to gauge the growth and the numbers thing, look at our congressional delegation, how much ours has shrunk. Theirs is growing, I think, by an equal amount. Because they're doing that thing. We have got to think differently. We've got to recognize that without strong communities, nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. You can pop a big plant in the middle of a vacant field, and it's not bringing people here. We've got to get people coming back to Michigan, investing in Michigan, understanding that. And that can only happen with strong communities. So what have we been doing? We've had lots of meetings. We're continuing to meet with the administration and the legislature. The good news is we're probably having more real conversations about this than we've had in a very, very long time. Now, that's a long way from saying we got it all figured out, but the fact that we're having these conversations is very encouraging. We're going to continue to work really hard at that. We're doing a lot of this, going all over the state, talking to outside groups, because one of the things that we realized is city folks talking to city folks and Lansing folks talking to Lansing folks doesn't get you very far. My challenge to the folks in the room is to think about this. Put this in your own words. Think about it, why it matters to you. Put it in your own context. Tell your neighbors. Tell your legislator if you see them. Talk about it. Get folks understanding this. We all have a dog in this fight. And if your city fails, you're failing right along with it. We've got to start thinking differently about how we do this. We're working hard developing policy and drafting legislation because to make all this stuff work, obviously we've got to do that. So we have been working with attorneys. We want to make sure we have solutions that, should the opportunity present itself, will work. And we're very confident that we're making good progress there as well. And again, education outreach is very important. In addition to this stuff, you know, term limits in Lansing, most folks don't think about that. But I do, a lot. 43 new legislators in the House just this past cycle. That's a constant churn. And when they show up, they don't know anything. And God bless them for trying. And it's not just our issue. They got to get up to speed on all this stuff. And so it never ends. So we do a ton of education outreach, and we'll continue to do that because we think that at the end of the day is super important, especially on an issue like this. We've commissioned a few independent reports. There's a couple of them. The one on the left, if you're a numbers geek and you really want to get into the meat as to what's happened to local government, the one on the left is for you, and I weep for you. The one on the right, it really gets to this idea of the value of great places. And it really gets back to a lot of what I've been talking about, because there is real and measurable economic value in investing in strong communities. And that report helps to lay out some of the arguments around some of that, so I would encourage you to do that. They are all available at this website we've created. It's called SaveMiCity.org. We're just cataloging all the information that we have, the reports and various things that we have there. So it's a great resource. We have our revenue sharing loss calculator, so we update that every year. Try to give communities an estimate of what we think they've lost by the revenue sharing diversions. It's a very helpful tool if you're talking about this with somebody, because you can have an order of magnitude. And again, I think one of the great values of that is wherever you're from and you see that number, it means something. And you can start to imagine what you could have done with that money. So it's a great thing and a great conversation piece. There's a lot of other research reports, not just ours. We beg, borrow, and steal stuff from lots of great university reports, and other organizations like CRC and others have allowed us to put stuff up there, so that's great stuff too. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. We'll be happy to answer questions. We are taping this for cable, though, so if you do have a question, we ask that you wait till you get the mic, and then we'll be happy to answer it.
Hi. I would just like to understand better, you had said that Headley and Prop A nullify an upward trend to property valuation. Can you explain that more fully, possibly?
I'll try, and if you need to do longer, I'll have you do it afterwards. But you essentially have Headley tries to manage the growth in revenues by dealing with millage rates. So it says if property in aggregate across the whole community grows faster than inflation, we're going to roll the millage rate back. They call that a Headley rollback, so that the city only gets inflationary growth, okay? Prop A says, so let me back up one more step. So the reason Prop A had to be done was it was a very booming economy at the time, and property values were going up a lot, but not uniformly. So this side of town might have gone up 30%, and that side of town went up 2%. And so when they did the whole thing across, these folks were thrilled, and these folks were saying, I'm still struggling to pay my taxes. I'm getting taxed out of my home. So they said, we need to do something on a parcel-by-parcel basis. So they came up with Proposal A, and they said, we're going to do the Prop A not on millage, we'll do that on value. And so if your property value grows more than inflation, you'll pay taxes on your taxable value, right? You guys get your assessment notice, and you see both those values? So that taxable value got created as part of Proposal A. And then when those values, when a property's sold, it'll be uncapped, and that's when the rest of those taxes will come back into the cycle, okay? So that was the intent and the explanation, and I've been around long enough to know that's how it was discussed for the many, many months leading up to the vote. What people may or may not realize is when you vote on a constitutional amendment, you get, I think it's 150 words or thereabouts to explain what the amendment is. And when it passes, they take those 150 words and they throw that and 5 real smart guys in a room, and they say, don't come out until you've wrote 150 pages of law to make that work. So it was in the legislative implementation process of Proposal A that they did a couple things. So they said, when those values pop up, let's plug that into that value change under Headley, which has the effect of reducing the millage rate to negate it. That was never the intention. The intention was those dollars would be lost as long as that ownership was consistent, and when it finally sold, that's when those revenues would finally have a chance to catch up. So there's, depending on how long someone's in a home, it could be 2 years, it could be 20 years before that catch-up occurs. So if you did not include those values in that rollback calculation, that would preserve the inflationary growth and allow that growth on the thing. The second part of that, wait, I lost my own head now. What was the rest of your question? I apologize.
Well, I mean, you answered that. But
okay.
Do those legislative restraints just apply to inflationary growth, or is there a different effect if you have new build or home improvement?
So new builds, that's a good question. New builds are not part of that equation. So anything that's new is always outside of that. And the expectation was when the pop-up occurred, it would be treated like new, because what it really is called is values not previously subject to taxation. Fancy way of saying new.
Okay.
Well, pop-ups were not subject to taxation, and they should be treated that way, but they're not.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask, as far as the language that's being drafted, once it's finally drafted, do you anticipate any opposition at the state level, or will it?
Yeah. No.
So what's the game plan? What are the action items?
So, I mean, Lansing, any legislative process is you're dealing with hundreds of people, varying political ideologies or whatever. So we have been doing, I'll go back to the education outreach part of it. We're really spending a lot of time talking to as many folks as we can, getting to understand this on a deeper level and why it's important. And I'm cautiously optimistic folks are understanding this on a higher level. Now, that's a long way from punching the end zone. I mean, in Lansing, beyond the goal line with first down goal to go and not punch it in. So we're going to work really hard at that. It's very complicated, and a lot of these issues overlap and go back and forth. So again, that's the whole purpose for wanting to get folks to understand this better. We feel very strongly that the more people understand this and can put that in their terms, explain why they care, that matters a lot. That matters a lot. I mean, they're used to having the mayor and the city council and the city managers yell at them. They need to hear from the residents, say, you know what? Maybe it's as simple as, if it was up to me, I'd like to see more dollars coming locally than keeping in Lansing. I care more about these services and those services. If that's how you feel, share that. Because that's the feedback that they need to understand. And again, we really think if you take a step back and you think about this, the economic importance to the entire system of investing locally has been missed for a very long time. And I think we're really starting to see the effects of that. If you're driving through here, if you're coming here to locate a business, and you're driving over the surface of the moon to get there, and things just aren't quite as good as maybe a couple other places I've checked out, I'm probably going to ask myself, do I want to put that business there? And, again, we have this idea we want to drive government to be the cheapest all the time. If we can do it cheaper, it's better. If we were going to start a business, if we were going to open a restaurant, we wouldn't drive down and suddenly get to an abandoned block and go, well, this is awesome. Maybe we can get this place really cheap. Let's go here, even though there's no people on the street and the windows are boarded up, so we won't have to buy any Windex. That'll be fantastic. We're going to save money all over the place here. That's not how, you don't think that way in any other world but here. So we got to start thinking differently. Let's invest and create those places that everybody wants to be a part of. And all ships rise approach to doing this. That's ultimately what sustains us as a state and as communities.
Thanks.
Hi. So returning revenues back to the cities is one option that would be ideal. Mm-hmm. And with Headley and Prop A being constitutional amendments, is there something short of doing another constitutional amendment that we can do to revise those? Yeah,
so just so I'm clear, the changes we're suggesting to Headley and Prop A are not changes to Headley and Prop A as constitutional amendments. The constitutional language would not change at all, nor would the intent of either one of those. Both of those had the intention of this inflationary limitation. Those would be preserved. What it would do is would provide the upward and downward mobility, which again, this whole idea of tracking with the economy, and it would allow that pop-up to not be part of that calculation. All of that is achievable through statute because it was part of the implementation legislation, not part of what people voted on. So it would not require a constitutional amendment.
Good evening. 2 questions. One, this tape, will it be available to to all the cities represented here? Because I think it's really important for our residents to be able to see the reason behind it.
I just saw a nodding yes, so
Okay,
yes to the
very
first
good.
one.
Very good. And 2, based on what I saw, I think it was $918 million for Detroit. I know it's about $12 million for Ferndale and a lot of other cities. How is that actually calculated? I mean, based on what I saw, it sounds like we're just taking away from these cities.
Then you saw it right. So how we calculate that is, in statute, it says how much, as a percent of sales tax, how much is supposed to flow into this formula to do that. But there's a caveat in there, and it says, subject to appropriation. So we know how much money is supposed to go into the system. When they don't appropriate it, it doesn't flow. So that's where the wheels come off the wagon and why it hasn't got there. So we know that number is the right number in aggregate. The individual communities, full disclosure, that's an estimate based on our part because the formula was never fully implemented because of the changes they made. So it's an estimate, as best guess we can make. But as far as like an order of magnitude, it's a pretty good number that you can put some stock in.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I thank you very much for letting me spend an hour or so with you. It was a really important issue, and again, I would encourage you, talk to folks about this. Don't go home and do nothing with this. This is an important issue, and we all have a really important stake in it, so thank you very much.